5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm space presenter David Southworth.
And I'm space expert Josh Barker.
Coming up today, NASA's budget has been announced for 2026 and it means a number of programmes are on the chopping block. How will this impact the future of space exploration? And space exploration is enormously expensive. Is it worth the cost? So, if any of you listened to our first episode, you'll be aware that we're not the presenters you may have heard that first time round. And as Ed and Dara said last time, we're going to be using a range of presenters. So, time for us to introduce ourselves properly. So, as I said, I'm David, I'm a space presenter. My main job is working with school groups that visit us at the National Space Centre, presenting workshops, planetarium shows, that kind of thing. Josh, tell us a bit about your job.
Yeah, my name's Josh. I'm really happy to be a presenter here, and I work both at the National Space Centre but also with a sister organisation just across the road called Space Park Leicester. And I work on developing skills, sharing space stories, and really celebrating what we do in space and science, and getting as many people excited about that as possible.
And of course, we're both excited that this podcast is a really good way of engaging with people, the general public, all kinds of people that may have an interest in space. Something that we, of course, are fascinated in, and it's a way of kind of getting other people excited in the way that we are.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really exciting to talk about new stories and things that are happening that we perhaps wouldn't get to deliver perhaps in a presentation or a holiday or something like that, to really start to talk about those little stories that perhaps we wouldn't give that attention to.
And that is a perfect way to lead into our first segment, Space Wows. This can be big or small stories from recent news that have caught our attention, made us go wow. So I'll start with mine. So I was interested in a craft that recently crashed down to Earth. This happens sometimes. Satellites are what we call deorbited. They're brought back down to Earth, but it's normally controlled. And the one that happened recently was very much not controlled. It's an old Soviet-era craft launched in 1972, originally due to be the Venera 7 probe. Heading all the way to Venus, landing on the surface of Venus, giving us all kinds of information. It didn't quite work out as planned. There was a timer issue with, I think, the thruster to get it out of low Earth orbit and send it on its way to Venus. That didn't work as planned, which meant it remained orbiting the Earth. Now, some chunks dropped down to the Earth straight away, pretty much. There were a few large objects landed in New Zealand, no injuries, fortunately. But some of it was left out in space. And the lander itself recently came down to Earth. So this is over 50 years later. On the 10th of May, it came down to Earth and it landed, we're told, in the Indian Ocean. Very close to Indonesia, could have been a nasty issue. And the reason I found this fascinating, I talked about how deorbiting is normally controlled. That means we can work out where it's going to go and we can fire thrusters or do things to make sure it lands in the ocean nice and safely. In this case, we were entirely down to chance. It could have hit a landmass. It could have caused some problems. Most of the Earth is covered in oceans. We were playing the odds and they got lucky. But that I thought was fascinating. It reminds us that there's so much stuff out there. Some of it is going to cause problems potentially in the future as we get more congested up there in orbit.
Yeah, but I think it's reassuring that it does come back. I think that's always the other thing. We do get concerned about things being up in space, but the fact that eventually they make their way back down is a little reassuring, as long as they do land in the ocean and not on top of me on the way to the shop or something like that.
Gravity does have a habit of doing that, Josh. What about your space wow? What's caught your attention?
My space wow this week was actually to do with the Northern Lights. I don't know if you saw the Northern Lights a few months ago.
I was lucky enough to see them in Norway a couple of years ago.
Excellent, yeah. So here in the UK, we obviously got a lot. Maybe some of our listeners got to see them as well. I was, in typical fashion, completely away from here and in the middle of cities and didn't get a chance to see them. So I was absolutely gutted. But it turns out in a news story this week that there's Northern Lights elsewhere. So some people might be aware that you get the Northern Lights not just here on Earth, but on other planets. And in fact, scientists from here in Leicester actually led a team that investigated the Northern Lights on Jupiter, of all places. So they used the Webb Space Telescope to take some of the best pictures we've ever seen of these incredible aurora. They're thousands of times bigger than the ones we get on Earth, and it turns out they're fascinating. So we were able to have a chat with him and find out a little bit about what's going on. And it turns out they're really different So the aurora there are so powerful that they actually happen much quicker. So you may have seen them in Norway, that they sort of undulate and gently sort of wave across the sky. And if anybody's got the chance to see that, they're quite slow and beautiful and ponderous. Turns out Jupiter, completely different. These things are changing literally every second to try and figure out what's going on. So the pictures that we've had back are phenomenal. The science that Johnny's been working on has been really interesting and really different and completely different to what we thought these northern lights were going to be. So that was pretty impressive for me this week.
Yeah, that's incredible. But I would have imagined, because Jupiter's so much further away, that the charged particles coming out from the sun would be weaker by the time they got there, and therefore we'd get weaker lights. But really interesting that you say we have a very different interaction with the magnetic field of Jupiter, all those kind of things interacting together. Fantastic, thank you very much. So for our first topic today, we are going to be talking about the recently announced NASA budget. I should say the proposed NASA budget for 2026. President Trump recently announced that. It looks like there's going to be some spending cuts, and we want to look into exactly what effects those are going to have. So Josh, perhaps you could take us through, first of all, the headlines of what's being cut, the amounts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you're right. So this is the proposed budget from President Donald Trump, and him and his advisors and cabinet have come together to say this is what we think the agency should be doing, and therefore this is the sort of funding that we're proposing. Now, it's important to note that this isn't finalised. What happens is this then goes across to the American Congress. They get to discuss and debate and chat about it, see what they agree with, speak to all the experts, and eventually they will come up with a decision. But it gives us a really good indication of what might be the priorities and what we might be going. And yeah, as you said, it's unfortunately, as the headlines are suggesting, not great news. It looks like there seems to be a lot of cuts. Donald Trump seems to be in a position at the moment where he's trying to reduce some of the government spending. That seems to have been one of his big policies. And NASA, being a government organisation, hasn't escaped any of that. So I think we're looking at around about a 25% drop overall.
Okay, so quite significant.
Yeah, reasonably significant. That's hitting a few different areas that we're thinking about.
Can you maybe spell out some of those areas that look like they're going to be impacted or maybe cut completely?
So I think the biggest one, which represents sort of the biggest drop, is actually just in what we call general space science. Okay. So this is looking at general space missions that are going out there. So a lot of headlines have been talking about the Nancy Grace Roman telescope. So this is a new space telescope. Many people might remember the James Webb Space Telescope. We talked about that earlier. Yes. They might have heard of Hubble. You know, there are many telescopes that look out into space to tell us about what's going on. And Nancy Grace Roman is a new telescope to do that. It's going to predominantly focus on looking for exoplanets, so planets around other stars, and find, search for life and things like that. That's one of the missions that we're looking at maybe cutting back on, which is a bit of a shame because that telescope is almost built and ready to go, which is why a lot of people are really concerned. With it being proposed, it might squeak in, but people are worried about that one. Things like the Mars sample return mission. So one big project at the moment is investigating Mars, our nearest neighbour in space. We've sent lots of probes and rovers and satellites to explore its surface, but we really want to bring material back to Earth, and that was sort of the next big goal for space science exploration of Mars.
And that, I think, is linked to the Perseverance rover, is it, that's been collecting samples and has already been laying them down in protective containers on the Mars surface?
Yeah, exactly right. So Perseverance has already been doing some of the setup work, and we're working on 2 or 3 missions internationally. They're going to go across and retrieve those and bring those back. But it looks like, under the current proposal, that NASA won't be moving forward with their segments of that mission across there.
Okay, so some quite significant cuts there. I think the Artemis mission, the plan to take people back to the moon, I think that's been impacted as well. Still going ahead, I believe, in the initial stages. Can you spell out a bit more about what's intended in these current proposals?
Yeah, so that's been a really interesting mission. The Artemis program is obviously a huge program. It's been going on for a long time, around about 20 years or so in the planning and the engineering to get there. We're almost at the point, we saw a couple of years ago the successful test flight of the mission. Artemis 1 launched, and we're just getting ready for Artemis 2, which will have people on board for the first time. And then all going well, Artemis 3 will be the first time we land back on the moon. So almost 60 years after we went there the first time, we're finally going to get humans back on the surface of the moon. So it's very, very exciting. And under the current proposal, that's where then that programme comes to an end. And that's really quite disappointing to a lot of people in the science community, because this was supposed to be a longer term mission, just like the Apollo mission had, 5 missions that sort of went on and continued to push that exploration. We're going to see that stop after Artemis 3 is where they want to call that now. this has been something that's been talked about for a while. This is a really, really expensive program. The Artemis and the Space Launch System program is not one that has escaped a lot of criticism. Over the last few years, people have been talking about it and it's been rumoured, but I think it's quite disappointing that we've got this far and it seems to have survived, and finally we're at this point where it's being deemed that perhaps it's not the most cost-effective way forward.
Now, at the risk of edging into politics, which I was going to try really hard not to do in this segment, but I think it's unavoidable. One thing I read was that as you say, Artemis 3, the next intended moon landing with people on board, after that, the Space Launch System, the rocket that NASA's developed for this program, is going to be retired. But I understand that part of the emphasis that President Trump has going forward for NASA is that he does want to continue with human flight and he does want to go back to the moon. I understand the intention is that that's going to be provided by private companies. So it'll be private companies providing that rocket ship to take people back to the moon. Now that does bring us into the politics of Elon Musk, because unavoidably, if you did listen to our first episode with Ed and Dara, you will know that there are hundreds of space private companies out there working in the space industry. However, realistically, the only one currently that has anything like the capability to take people to the moon is SpaceX. Now, Elon Musk, it's been widely talked about the potential conflict of interest. He is chief exec of SpaceX, also runs Tesla and has several other companies, and he has a role in Donald Trump's government as the head of, or one of the heads of the Department of Government Efficiency, looking at cutting public expenditure. We won't go into too much detail on that, but it does certainly raise the question of whether that conflict of interest may have fed into these cuts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting position to be in, because like you say, it's not all bad news. We're seeing these general cuts to NASA budget, but it is positive. The spin or the focus that the Trump administration are putting on is to say, well, actually, we really want to focus on human spaceflight. That's a big project that lots of people are interested in, and although we think that the SLS rocket isn't perhaps the best way to do that forever, we think that project sort of run its course, they want to invest in that. So we're actually seeing an increase in human spaceflight funding as part of this proposed budget. But you're right, a lot of that is going into using and working with private companies to support that mission. And as you say, that happens to line up with the private company that is probably best positioned to do that at the moment is SpaceX. You know, they're working on big rockets that will be equivalent to the Space Launch System. And so it is a really tricky balance of, how much we would like to hope that these things have been done properly, and that this is a generally well thought out strategy. And I hope that that's the case. And we'll find that out as it starts to get debated in Congress. I think that's the key thing that I think sets my mind a little bit at ease, is that even if there is perhaps things not quite, or maybe these things can sneak in, actually these processes don't just get decided like that. This has got to go through a process. Yeah,
I think that's very fair, and it's also worth pointing out, I was critical, I'd say, in my introduction about Elon Musk there, but I think it's worth pointing out that SpaceX have got themselves into that position well before Elon Musk was involved in this government role. So the reason they've got there, they've been working with NASA, but that is not related to his role in the Trump administration. So if that's how things pan out, as you say, we take it on trust that that's how they've got there.
And I think the other thing is that there are other private companies that are working as well. We've got the Starliner from Boeing has been in recent tests to start to work on those. We've had a recent partnership with Rocket Lab in New Zealand with the States as well. And we're seeing that it's not just this one. I think it's really tricky. SpaceX is a big company that do a lot, and so they get a lot of attention, but they're not the only one. And just like many of these others, they compete. They submit an idea, and if they can submit the best idea, then they go through. But these are big organisations that require lots of people working together and agreeing on the same sort of thing. So I think it can sometimes come across as perhaps maybe nefarious. I don't think it probably is that nefarious. I think these are genuinely well put together ideas, well engineered projects that are hopefully going to push us towards. I think that's ultimately what the goal of this seems to be.
So we could talk about this for a long time, but I want to move us on quickly. We've talked about the shift in NASA's agenda. We've talked about how the focus is intended to be more towards human spaceflight. Donald Trump's talked about how inspirational the Apollo missions were, and he wants something similar. What about if anyone else can step in and fill the gap? So we've talked briefly about SpaceX and other private companies that may be able to provide some alternative provision to NASA. What about other space agencies? You talked about the Mars Return mission, for example, Nancy Grace Roman. I know we have some precedents of, I'm thinking of the Rosalind Franklin mission to Mars a few years ago, which was going to be an ESA mission they were going to launch with Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. When the war with Ukraine started, the Russian involvement had to be dropped and they looked at other launch mechanisms. Will there be something similar, or is the potential for there to be something similar with other space agencies stepping in and taking up some of that slack?
I think there is, and I think that's a really good point to step back. And I think this is not, people would argue this is not great news for NASA. Ultimately, regardless of the shifting of their priorities, they're seeing less investment, and they're going to have to think about how they deal with that. But NASA are just one space agency. They're the one that we all think of because they're often the one that get the headlines, and they're quite large, in terms of those space agencies out there. But there are lots of other people doing that. And I think the Rosalind Franklin rover is a really great example. That's something that we've worked on for a long time in the UK, putting together the rover, working with international partners. And you're quite right. Something happened, in some cases it's often something bad like the Russia-Ukraine war, but other times it can be changing priorities or things, but you find those to step in. You say, well, we've got this, can we start to look at something else? And I think we might see that. I think we'll definitely see certain projects that can work with other international partners to say, we can provide a rocket for you, or we can fill in with this instrument, or maybe we can take the work that you've already done and use it as part of our projects. And I think we will see that collaboration and continue to advance and do these things.
Okay, so there's hope. And I think, just to finish, it's worth reminding everyone, this is a proposal. It has to go through Congress. There are precedents for these things being voted down. Maybe some of the senators in space-oriented states, Texas and Florida spring to mind, might still vote it down. We'll see where we get to. And if you at home have any questions about NASA's budget or any of the other topics we cover on this podcast, please do send them in. We'll be trying to address those in future episodes. You can email those to podcast@spacecentre.bsky.social. So we've talked a lot there about NASA's budget, the proposed cuts, but they do still have a large budget. It's a large amount of money. That's also true for other country space agencies as well. And I think a question that a lot of people at home would have is that huge cost of space exploration actually justified? I'm going to start with some facts and figures on this. I'm going to focus on NASA again because it is the largest space agency. It's the one we have easy figures for. The cuts that we've just been talking about, it's taking it down from around about 0.5% to 0.4% of the US total federal budget, so government spending. So it's a cut, it's a significant cut. Historically, peaked in the 60s, NASA's budget was over 4% of the federal budget, but since the early 70s onwards, it's always fluctuated between around 0.5% and 1%. So historically, we're still roughly at the kind of level that you expect, other than the Apollo missions. So all that said, it is a large amount of money, and as I say, can we talk about the benefits? You and I are in the space industry. We of course believe in space exploration and all the benefits we can get, but I think it'd be really useful for us to spell out some of those benefits that we believe in to the people listening at home.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult topic, these sorts of things, because they are huge numbers. We talk about space missions costing millions, billions of pounds, and I'm sure most of us, if we found £1 billion lying around that we could use, would be very, very happy. But I think that's important to think about, that percentage of government spending. As a country, it's not that much compared to other things. I think when I was looking at it, I think the UK spends something like £650 million on space every year, whereas our military is about £56 billion. So it's a big difference, but £600 million is still a lot of money, and it can go a long way. But I think I'd agree. I think space brings a lot of benefits to the Earth in a huge range of different ways that we find and we rely on.
So, one obvious one I can think of is satellites observing the Earth. In fact, that's one of the things that is going to be affected by President Trump's proposed cuts, is a reduction in the kind of environmental use of Earth observation satellites. Can you tell us a bit about all the benefits that we get from those satellites? I think that's been an incredible achievement of the space industry over the years.
Yeah, our ability to look back at the Earth and understand it has completely changed our understanding of what's going on. And that starts at really simple ways. So, for example, I don't know about you, but I checked the weather this morning. Maybe people at home, worked out whether they needed a coat or umbrella or to put the sun cream on or something like that. Well, most of that's all done using satellite information. We use satellites to track weather patterns and clouds and growing storms to work out those things. And using those has completely changed how accurate we were able to predict those. So something we interact with every day. But they also go beyond that. You know, one really big topic at the moment that many people at home might be thinking about is the climate and the environment. You know, we hear constant news about how our climate's changing, the environmental impacts of various things that we're doing, and most of that is monitored from space. There was a fascinating report that showed that the majority of the key indicators, so whether that's the temperature of the atmosphere or the waves in the sea or the wind speeds, these key environment markers, the majority of those can be best measured from space. You know, we can take measurements from down the ground, but to do it the best, you need a satellite. And so giving us that gives us more information. It allows us to make better decisions as we're trying to come up with ways to fix things, as to adjust our behaviours and make sure that things are being productive and going well down here on Earth. Information from satellites really gives us the benefits of those.
Yeah, that's certainly something I was disappointed about in the Trump proposals, was the reduction in Earth observation. Something else that people might be interested in, though, we talked about the benefits to the environment, but surely there's a carbon cost of putting things up into space. How does that balance play out?
So yeah, ultimately these things, we have to balance it. You know, we know that we are having an impact, but we hope that we're getting a benefit. You know, there's an old saying, what is it? You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. You know,
Yes.
Unfortunately, it would be perfect if we could have an impactless way of doing it, but we can't. And so it's about making sure we get the best out of what we do, you know, so that whatever impact it has, we're getting all the benefits that we can have and generally helping to improve the situation.
Absolutely. Now, some other benefits of space, the space industry over the years, are one that I'm really interested in. I'm sure you'll have a view, maybe a couple of examples for us. I saw a fascinating letter sent, this was back in 1970, I believe it was, during the height of the Apollo program. It was someone senior in NASA. I think he was maybe the head scientist of the Marshall Space Centre, something like that. And he was responding to a letter from a member of the public asking about how can you justify this ridiculous expenditure on taking men to the moon when people are dying, children are starving in Africa, that kind of thing. And he wrote a very interesting and very considered letter. And one of the things he really highlighted was the spin-offs of space exploration. Things that we have discovered or developed that maybe we either wouldn't have done without going to space. It's accelerated things in unexpected directions, like many of the best inventions over the years. So yeah, perhaps you could give us a couple of examples maybe of those kind of benefits of space as well.
I think that's one of the really interesting things, is that we're doing things in space that are really pushing the boundaries of what we can do. You know, whenever we build a rocket, it's often the most powerful engine that we've ever built. Or, you know, if we're trying to get a probe safely back from the atmosphere to the ground, we have to develop new technologies to protect that. And I think what we do is, by doing this, we find new stuff. So one of my favourite examples is the space shuttle. Many people might remember the space shuttle taking off and carrying astronauts into space. Well, it turns out that one of the pumps they used for the engines to get all the fuel through the engine quick enough, turns out if you shrunk it right the way down, it was an excellent valve for your heart. And so it meant that suddenly all these people that needed valve replacements in their heart were using space shuttle technology to have happier, healthier lives that, you know, would go on for much longer than technology would previously do. So those are, you know, big impacts. Smaller impacts, one of my favorites, if you wear glasses at home and you've got a nice scratch-proof lensing, that was developed for space helmets to protect them while they were up there on spacewalks and things like that. So there's all sorts of little bits that we perhaps wouldn't realise, you know, and maybe we'd invent them in another way, but actually we can use this technology to help us down on Earth as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. The heart valve example is a fascinating one. I was expecting something more like the scratch-proof lenses. I hadn't heard of the heart valve. That's quite a significant and large, very direct impact that's come from the work that's been done in the space industry. I want to talk about one more potential benefit. I'm thinking of one very particular mission. So, existential threats to the Earth. Of course, we have climate change, and we talked about Earth observation helping us understand that and maybe improve the situation. But another one is impacts from space, asteroids, comets, coming down through space and colliding with us here on Earth. That, of course, is what we believe killed out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And NASA undertook a mission recently called the DART mission. And that was aiming to see if we were able to redirect an asteroid in space, so that if we got prior notice that something was coming towards us, we may potentially have the ability to direct it away from the Earth. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that mission. I'm sure you know more about it than I do.
Well, I know a little bit, and actually this dials right back to one of my first jobs when I joined the National Space Centre many years ago. I was part of what's called the Near Earth Observation Detection Team. I can't remember the official name, but it was my job basically every morning before I was allowed my coffee at work was to check a database that had all of the asteroids and comets that were moving through the solar system to see if any were going to get close to the Earth. And there was a special email that I had to send off to someone if we were about to be wiped out by an asteroid. Thankfully, I never had to send that.
I was going to ask if you ever found
Luckily, never had to send that email, but terrified that I might have to. But that's something that we think about. We know that space is busy. I think one thing that surprised everyone, people may have seen news stories of asteroids whizzing past, and that sort of always hits the news every couple of months. But it turns out these objects are passing 3 or 4 times a day. We're getting objects passing close to the Earth. Most of them are small and not on a course. But one day we might wake up, like the dinosaurs, and find that there's an asteroid on its way. And so, like you say, the DART mission was a real test to say, can we save ourselves from that?
And was it successful? Can we save ourselves?
Thankfully it was, which I'm glad, because there was an open call before that for other proposals. That people had proposed painting asteroids white or dragging them off with rockets and all sorts of wild ideas. But thankfully it turns out just simply smashing into the side of it is enough to nudge it gently off course. And like you say, with enough notice, we can protect ourselves from space. So that's a very direct benefit of going to space and exploring space that couples, I think, with all those extra benefits that we see.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. So, as I said at the start of this, obviously you and I are in the space industry. We are a little bit biased. We do believe in the benefits of space, but hopefully we've provided a few examples there for people at home that might justify that belief. So I think just to kind of conclude that section, it is disappointing that NASA are potentially cutting their budget. That might reduce some of those benefits, particularly Earth observation. We've talked about a lot there. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's see how things pan out over the next couple of months in Congress and potentially beyond Trump's presidency as well. Bit of a change of gear now from that quite serious topic we've been discussing. Every week we want to try and bring you ways to engage with space. And this week I wanted to focus on our half-term programme here at the National Space Centre. This half-term we're going to be focusing on mysteries of space. So Josh, I thought I would quickly ask you to very briefly tell us one of your favourite mysteries of space.
Oh, I think probably my biggest mystery about space at the moment might be dark matter.
That's a big topic.
It is a big topic. It's this weird invisible matter that we can barely see and barely interact with, but everything we've learned about the universe suggests that it makes up over 30% of the stuff around us. So it's a huge mystery about what it is, how it works, and how we know so much about it. How about you? Do you have a big question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit older than you, so mine's a bit more old school. Life on Mars. Life on Mars has fascinated, the idea that there could be life on Mars has fascinated people for decades, probably centuries. We still don't know. We don't think there's life on Mars. Maybe there could be life in the past. It used to have very different conditions to now. There could still be bacterial life under the surface. We just don't know. So that's certainly a mystery that I find very fascinating. So if you at home would like to engage with those kind of mysteries or others, why not visit the National Space Centre during our half-term programme? It's running from the 24th of May to the 1st of June. We'll be talking about those 2 mysteries that Josh and I just mentioned, as well as black holes, the potential existence of Planet X, and the ultimate fate of the universe.
And if you have other mysteries or any questions about any of the things we've talked about or you'd like to hear us talk about here on the podcast, send your questions in to us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you, David.
And thank you very much to you all listening or watching at home. We'll be back next Friday to go once again beyond the space news headlines. So make sure to subscribe to Space Now to make sure you don't miss any episode. See you soon.